Imagine being slowly lowered into a vat of boiling water, your flesh blistering. Screams reverberating off the cold stone walls, while onlookers gaze in both horror and awe. This was not a scene from a horror novel or medieval legend. It was the dreadful fate that befell Richard Roose in 1531. His death remains one of the most appalling instances of legal cruelty, sanctioned not by a savage chieftain, but by one of England's most iconic rulers, King Henry VIII. This method of execution wasn't selected merely for its shock value. It served as a calculated form of justice that mirrored the anxieties and pressures of Tudor-era England. The execution of Richard Roose is more than a chilling anecdote. From the past, it marks the convergence of politics, religion, and the ruthless enforcement of royal authority during a critical turning point in English history. At the time, England under Henry VIII was undergoing significant transformation. The king's authority was approaching absolute power, and actions labeled as treason were increasingly met with ghastly retribution. But why would a punishment as excruciating as boiling be considered fitting, particularly for a humble cook? What offense could have merited such a barbaric end? To grasp this grim episode, we must revisit a period when justice was often brutal and public a spectacle intended not merely to reprimand the offender, but to deliver a stark warning to any who might challenge royal supremacy. Richard Roose's story offers us a rare glimpse into the Tudor psyche, where notions of crime and justice were worlds apart from our present-day values. His fate serves as a stark reminder of how far modern legal systems have commingled, how fragile the boundaries of civility can be. As we explore this unsettling case, we will examine not just how Roose died, but the reasons behind the reasons shaped by one of the most formidable monarchs in history. We'll unpack the political instability, religious upheaval, and personal vendettas that contributed to a punishment so vicious it would later be banned, even in a time renowned for its cruelty. This is more than a tale of brutality. It's a powerful exploration of dominance, fear, and the horrifying outcomes when those forces are exercised without compassion. The year was 1531, and events were about to boil over, quite literally, in Tudor England. Henry VIII, not yet the bloated figure history would later depict, was already exhibiting the harshness that would characterize his rule. And he was about to make an example of a cook in a fashion so brutal it would shock even his own era. In the heart of Smithfield, London, a bubbling pot would soon be transformed into the tool of one of the most infamous executions in recorded historia. Chilling testament to the far-reaching power of England's most notorious king. To fully comprehend the horror of Richard Roose's execution, we must first understand the environment that birthed it. England, in the early 1530s, was a volatile blend of religious and political unrest. Henry VIII, once praised as a Renaissance prince, was morphing into the despotic ruler remembered today. His relentless quest for a male successor had led him into direct conflict with the Catholic Church, thrusting the nation into the turbulence of the Reformation. The once celebrated prince was beginning his metamorphosis into the despotic ruler history remembers. His obsessive pursuit of a male successor drove him to question his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, launching a confrontation with the Catholic Church and thrusting England into the upheaval that would become known as the English Reformation. This period marked an era where the king's authority was being enforced with unparalleled intensity. Parliament had shifted from acting as a counterbalance to becoming an extension of royal influence. Statutes were rewritten to align with the monarch's personal ambitions, and those who resisted found themselves facing increasingly harsh repercussions. The old feudal structures were disintegrating, replaced by a new image of the sovereign, an all-powerful ruler accountable only to God, and gradually conflating divine will with his own. Religious unease seeped into nearly every facet of life in Tudor England. The threat of heresy loomed over the populace, as both staunch Catholics and emerging Protestant groups eyed each other with deep mistrust and dread. Poisoning, in particular, invoked a unique kind of terror in the Tudor imagination, viewed not merely as homicide, but as a deceitful and cowardly act, often associated with women, outsiders, or those unwilling to face their enemies directly. In a realm where the king's person was considered sacred and semi-divine, any threat to his household through poisoning wasn't just a felony, it was blasphemy. London itself was a city of extremes. Opulent palaces stood in uneasy proximity to filth-ridden ghettos, and the dazzling splendor of courtly ceremonies coexisted with public executions that drew immense crowds, rivaling any civic celebration. Smithfield, where Roose would eventually meet his fate, was already notorious as a site of execution, particularly for religious dissenters burned at the stake. It functioned as a brutal arena of state justice, where punishments were not only meted out, but also performed, serving as both a stern deterrent and public spectacle. In this unstable climate, the role of cook or food taster bore unexpected importance. Those charged with preparing meals for the elite held enormous responsibility. Their hands held the power to preserve or destroy lives. A cook in royal or noble service was expected to embody loyalty. Any betrayal from such a trusted role was viewed with heightened revulsion. Richard Roose worked in the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, man later canonized, but who at the time was already in a perilous position due to his vocal opposition to King Henry's attempts to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine. Roose himself was not historically notable until the scandal that would lead to his gruesome end. He was merely a cook employed by Bishop Fisher, an esteemed cleric, and more importantly, a fervent defender of Catherine of Aragon. In her battle against Henry VIII's ambitions, Fisher had publicly resisted the king's efforts to dissolve his marriage, positioning himself as a major obstacle during a time when Henry VIII was becoming increasingly hostile toward dissent. The incident that sealed Richard Roose's fate occurred on the 18th of February, 1531. Several members of Bishop Fisher's household became gravely ill after eating porridge prepared by Roose. Two of them, a man named Bennet Serwyn and an unnamed impoverished woman who had received food through the bishop's charity, succumbed to the illness. Bishop Fisher himself, who reportedly consumed only a small portion, fell violently sick but survived. Suspicion quickly turned to poisoning, and Roose was swiftly identified as the likely perpetrator. When interrogated, Roose is said to have confessed to adding a substance to the dish, though he insisted it was intended as a prank, a purgative meant to cause discomfort, not death. However, this claim offered little defense. Whether intended as a deadly act or a foolish joke, tampering with food in the household of a high-ranking religious figure, especially one connected to the royal sphere, was taken with grave seriousness. In a time before modern medical science, the distinction between a harmful joke and fatal poisoning was dangerously blurred. The political implications of the case were equally significant. Bishop Fisher was no ordinary priest. He was a leading opponent of the king's reformist agenda. Although there was no direct evidence linking Roose's actions to a broader conspiracy, the circumstances were suspicious enough to prompt speculation. Was this a failed attempt on Fisher's life, a warning, or merely a prank that turned tragic? These questions continue to intrigue historians. What is beyond doubt, however, is that Henry VIII became personally invested in the case. The king, who was in the process of tightening his grip on both the church and the legal system, saw the incident as an opportunity to assert his growing authority and to override conventional judicial channels. Instead of permitting Roose to be judged through the existing legal framework, Henry took the radical step of elevating the case to Parliament. The king's response was both immediate and extraordinary. He had Parliament enact a special statute tailored specifically to address this incident. The 1531 Act for Poisoning declared such crimes to be acts of high treason offenses against the crown itself and, crucially, made the law retroactive. This meant it could be applied to Roose, despite the fact that the statute did not exist at the time of his offense. The legislation stipulated that Roose was to be boiled to death, a method of execution never before officially written into English law. This gruesome penalty was not chosen arbitrarily. It was selected for its symbolic and horrifying effect. Poisoners operated using bubbling pots and scalding cauldrons. Now, the very tools of their crime would be turned against them. This was a macabre form of poetic justice zone that demonstrated the king's ability not only to end life, but to shape both the method and the meaning of an execution. The fact that the law was applied retroactively made it particularly disturbing, even by the standards of Tudor justice. It broke the long-standing principle that individuals should only be judged by laws in place at the time their alleged crime occurred, a tenet acknowledged even by medieval legal minds. Yet Henry VIII was increasingly placing himself above conventional legal boundaries. This case represented a major milestone in his consolidation of authority over both secular and ecclesiastical law, paving the way for his eventual split from Rome and self-appointment as head of the Church of England. Parliament's compliance in passing such an extreme statute shows just how thoroughly it had become a tool of royal authority. Although theoretically a representative institution, by this point, Parliament mostly functioned to legitimize the king's will. Few dared to stand in opposition to Henry, especially in cases where he had shown strong personal interest. The poisoning incident, touching both the security of the monarchy and elite households, fell neatly into that category. The language used in the act left no doubt as to the king's opinion of poisoning. It was portrayed as abhorrent and described as a practice rarely seen before in England, implying it was a foreign corruption that had invaded the kingdom. This xenophobic implication was consistent with Tudor propaganda, which often painted England as morally upright and under siege from outside depravity. By casting poisoning as a foreign evil, Henry positioned himself as a protector of national virtue narrative that would support his later battles with Rome. On the 5th of April, 1531, Richard Roose was brought to Smithfield in London to be executed. A large gathering assembled to witness the extraordinary event, drawn by both the unusual crime and the sensational punishment. Public executions were a staple of Tudor society. combining civic drama with moral instruction. But this method boiling was so rare and gruesome that it sparked particular curiosity. Authorities likely encouraged public turnout. The more spectators who witnessed this extreme demonstration of justice, the more effectively the intended message would circulate. The setup itself was chilling in its simplicity. A massive pot of water brought to a furious boil. Unlike hanging or decapitation, which could end life swiftly, boiling was designed to inflict prolonged and excruciating suffering. Some reports claim that Roose was not dropped into the cauldron all at once, but instead lowered slowly, prolonging both his agony and the morbid drama for those in attendance. Whether Roose was lowered using a mechanical apparatus or by executioners with ropes remains uncertain due to limited historical documentation. Surviving reports of the execution are scarce, but they make it clear that Roose endured excruciating agony. The 16th century historian Edward Hall remarked that Roose roared mightily during the execution, his cries reverberating through Smithfield and making an impact even on a public used to gruesome displays. The physical toll was horrific. Boiling water would have caused immediate and severe burns, triggering shock and ultimately death through a mix of intense pain, cardiac failure, and internal trauma as the heat ravaged his tissues. The crowd that witnessed this terrifying event likely included individuals from all layers of London society, tradesmen, clergy, craftsmen, and possibly even members of the nobility or court officials present. To ensure the king's command had been fulfilled, though their reactions weren't extensively recorded. Even in a time well acquainted with violent punishment, this execution stood out for its cruelty. It was crafted to instill fear and horror, and, by all accounts, it achieved its aim. Following his death, Roose's body would have been a gruesome sight. Blistered flesh, peeling skin, and tissue partially cooked by the boiling water. What became of his remains is not clearly documented. Criminals were often denied proper burial rites, their corpses left on display as deterrents or handed over to anatomical institutions. As someone condemned for treason, Roose may have faced further posthumous indignities, though specific records of this are lacking. The execution of Richard Roose left a lasting impact on Tudor England. Immediately afterward, the Act for Poisoning remained in effect, establishing the precedent that such crimes warranted exceptional punishment. Though Roose was the first to be executed by boiling under Henry VIII statute, he would not be the last. Records confirm that in 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy also met her end in a boiling pot for the same offense, proof that the punishment became an official, though seldom used, tool in the Tudor justice system. For Bishop John Fisher, whose household had been targeted in the incident, the poisoning added another element of risk to his already tenuous situation. He continued to resist Henry's efforts to sever ties with Rome and annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, defiance that would ultimately cost him his life. In 1535, when he was beheaded for refusing to recognize the Act of Supremacy, some scholars have theorized that the poisoning may have been an early attempt to silence Fisher before his resistance became too troublesome. Though conclusive proof of such a plot remains elusive, Roose's case also highlights the extraordinary legal power Henry VIII was amassing. His ability to push Parliament to pass retroactive laws targeting a specific individual revealed just how far traditional safeguards had deteriorated under his reign. This pattern would not only continue, but accelerate throughout the 1530s, as Henry increasingly used acts of Parliament to reshape both religious doctrine and civil law. according to his personal agenda, culminating in his formal break from Rome and his proclamation as the supreme head of the Church of England. Assessing public reaction to Roose's execution is challenging due to the scarcity of detailed surviving accounts. Still, the extraordinary brutality of the method suggests it was meant to provoke more than mere fear. It aimed to generate a deep, visceral horror. Poisoning carried connotations of secrecy, foreign influence, and betrayal traits that Henry more and more attributed to his enemies, particularly those loyal to the papacy. By orchestrating such a dramatic punishment for poisoners, Henry was making a symbolic declaration that he held dominion over even the covert threats to his reign. On the international stage, the execution likely contributed to the growing image of Henry as a ruler unafraid of cruelty. Foreign ambassadors routinely relayed political developments back to their home courts, and a punishment as rare and gruesome as boiling would not have gone unnoticed. As his rupture with Rome deepened, Henry's readiness to employ ruthless tactics against those he saw as adversaries became central to his reputation abroad among both allies and enemies. However, the gruesome practice of boiling as a method of execution did not endure long beyond Henry's reign. His son, Edward VI, abolished the statute in 1547, only a year after Henry's passing. This change formed part of a broader effort to revise treason laws, which had become convoluted and excessive under Henry's rule. While Edward's regime did not abandon harsh punishment, entirely religious persecution persisted with new targets there appeared to be some recognition that certain measures had crossed a line. Repealing the boiling statute reflected shifting perspectives on what constituted acceptable punishment, even during a time still marked by public executions and widespread violence. Though grisly executions remained common throughout the Tudor and Stuart dynasties, certain methods began to be viewed as too extreme or barbaric. The progression of penal practices reveals much about how cultures define, challenge, and redraw the limits of acceptable violence, even within systems that tolerate state-executed death as routine. To modern scholars, the case of Richard Roose is a valuable window into the machinery of Tudor justice and governance. It illustrates the deeply personal nature of royal authority, how the monarch's preferences could swiftly become law, how punishments reflected the king's fixations, and how legal norms could be reshaped to serve political ends. The Roose case exemplifies how absolute power functioned in a system where the line between personal monarchy and official state was often indistinct or non-existent. The execution also underscores the era's complicated relationship with poisoners, both a literal crime and a symbolic threat. Poison was dreaded not merely as a means of assassination, but as a representation of hidden decay and foreign menace. As Henry separated from Rome and assumed spiritual leadership of England, the idea of poisoners, something stealthily undermining the health of the nation, became a powerful metaphor in Tudor political and cultural discourse. Roose's execution was intended not only to serve as a deterrent to would-be poisoners, but to symbolically cleanse the kingdom of perceived moral and political contamination. From a medical standpoint, Tudor views of poison were still rooted in outdated theories of bodily humors and miasma, without the benefit of modern toxicology. Distinguishing between spoiled food and food that had been maliciously altered was often impossible. This uncertainty likely contributed to the particular dread surrounding poison, combining the horror of murder with ambiguity about its origins, making it feel especially unnatural and insidious. The significance of Richard Roose's death reaches far beyond its immediate circumstances. To legal scholars, the case stands as a notable example of ex post facto legislation laws applied retroactively to actions that were not crimes when committed. The principle that one cannot be punished for acts that were legal at the time is a cornerstone of many contemporary legal systems, including the US Constitution. The Roose episode acts as a stark warning of the dangers posed when this principle is sacrificed for political ends. For those studying the politics of Henry VIII's reign, the case highlights the deeper factional battles tied to the king's break with the Roman Church. Bishop Fisher, in whose household the poisoning took place, was a leading figure of the conservative Catholic bloc opposing Henry's marital and religious reforms. Though no hard evidence ties the poisoning directly to these power struggles, the broader context and Henry's unusual level of involvement suggests this was not merely a criminal matter, but a politically charged event. The choice of execution method, boiling, also sheds light on the symbolic language of punishment in Tudor England. Executions were never just practical acts of justice. They were public rituals designed to express authority, maintain order, and convey meaning. The penalty often reflected the crime itself in a dark form of theatrical symmetry. Those who betrayed the realm were dismembered because their treason metaphorically tore the country apart. Heretics were burned because their teachings were seen as consuming the spiritual body of Christ. Poisoners, having used pots and pans as instruments of death, were themselves cooked to liven a especially grim brand of poetic justice. On a psychological level, this extreme form of punishment exposes the unique fears and anxieties of the Tudor imagination. Poisoning represented a terrifying threat precisely because it weaponized something as ordinary and essential as food. It was an invisible danger, capable of striking anyone, regardless of class or strength. It often left little evidence behind. In a culture deeply invested in hierarchy and social control, poisoning was a subversive act that threatened the very structure of power. The rarity of this punishment, enacted only a few times in English, history underscores its extraordinary character. Even in an age accustomed to brutal methods like hanging, burning, and decapitation, boiling was considered unusually severe. This fact speaks volumes about how societies calibrate punishment and how certain crimes are singled out for exceptional retribution. The extremity of the response reflects the profound sense of unease that poisoning stirred in Tudor society. The tale of Richard Roose continues to strike a chord with modern readers, largely because it sits at the crossroads of several timeless issues: the extent of governmental authority, the balance between crime and punishment, and the deliberate use of terror as a political instrument. In a world where some regimes still resort to brutal and inhumane punishments, Roose's death reminds us how easily the notion of justice can be co-opted into a theatrical display of power, overshadowing any true pursuit of fairness or proportionality. Henry VIII's direct involvement in the case also highlights enduring concerns over the rule of law versus the rule of individuals. The monarch's ability to enact a law tailored to condemn a specific person underscores the dangers posed when unchecked authority is concentrated in a single figure. The very purpose of constitutional governance and the division of powers is to prevent such arbitrary control, yet these questions remain relevant even in present-day democracies. Even now, we continue to wrestle with the boundaries of executive authority and its potential for abuse. The public spectacle of punishment in Tudor England invites comparison with today's media-driven portrayals of crime and justice. Though we no longer attend executions in city squares, stories of violence and retribution dominate modern news and entertainment. Humanity's enduring obsession with the grotesque and punitive spans across eras and cultures, even as its modes of expression evolve through technological and social change. To contemporary audiences, the medical aspects of Roose's case are particularly thought-provoking. The Tudor inability to distinguish between accidental foodborne illness and intentional poisoning serves as a powerful reminder of how far scientific knowledge has advanced. In the absence of forensic toxicology, many throughout history were likely wrongfully accused of poisoning when natural causes were to blame. Ultimately, Roose's execution serves as a powerful reminder of how drastically our views on punishment have shifted. While debates over the death penalty persist, there is now widespread international agreement condemning torture and excessively cruel penalties. Richard Roose's death occurred during a period when suffering wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of justice, it was the intended outcome. Today, at least in principle, modern legal systems reject such logic, even if inconsistencies remain in practice. As we reach the end of this disturbing historical account, we are left with more uncertainty than clarity. Was Roose genuinely guilty of attempted murder? Or was he simply the architect of a misguided prank that spiraled out of control? Did he act on his own? Or was he manipulated as part of a deeper political agenda? The surviving records are too limited to answer these questions definitively, leaving ample space for continued investigation and debate. What remains undeniable is that his execution provides a vivid case study in how legal systems have been shaped and sometimes distorted by power, fear, and political necessity throughout the ages. From the retroactive legislation that sealed his fate to the chilling public nature of his execution, every element of Richard Roose's case highlights the stark contrast between Tudor-era justice and the foundational values of modern legal systems. Yet, this case also underscores certain enduring patterns: the use of punishment as a public message, the intricate link between criminality and political power, and society's instinct to respond with particular revulsion to acts that disrupt the expected norms of daily life. Henry VIII's England was a kingdom in flux, shifting away from medieval models of monarchy and justice toward a more consolidated and autocratic form of governance that would shape the coming centuries. The Roose affair, marked by direct legislative intervention and royal decree, represents a significant milestone in that transformation. It reveals a sovereign increasingly inclined to forge new legal instruments to assert dominance, heralding the sweeping religious and political upheavals soon to follow. For present-day observers reflecting on this grim episode, the execution of Richard Roose serves as both a stark caution and a revealing lens. It stands as a warning about the perils of unchecked authority and the cruelty that can arise when justice becomes a tool of political necessity rather than a reflection of law and fairness. Yet it also offers a sobering comparison to our own times, showing how far we've progressed in upholding human rights and the rule of law, while reminding us of the work still needed to fully live up to those principles. Though the cauldron at Smithfield has long gone cold, the moral and philosophical questions it evokes about power, justice, and human dignity remain very much alive. Richard Roose, a man who may otherwise have disappeared into obscurity, emerged instead as a symbol of a brutal age and a powerful case study in how punishment has been used and misused throughout history. His gruesome fate, enacted by a monarch whose legacy has become synonymous with tyranny, is a lasting reminder of why safeguarding legal integrity and limiting the reach of authority are essential in any era.